So I'm going to go ahead and begin Pat's introduction, and then others can join us as they filter in. So I want to introduce Pat Corrigan. He is a distinguished professor of psychology at the Illinois Institute of Technology, and Pat and I have collaborated several times on several different projects, and we're very thankful to have him here to speak to all of us about his work around combating stigma around mental health. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Pat.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks everyone for coming back and spending this end of the day with me. I do encourage any questions or comments. If you want to put them in the chat room, Eric will keep track of it and we can end with those kind of things. So I've come to believe the stigma of mental illness can be as big a problem for people with mood disorders as the mood disorder itself. And so over the last 20 years, we really tried to understand how to beat this problem. What I wanted to do today is remind us briefly what the stigma of mental illness is. It's not hard to keep in mind. For schizophrenia, it's the idea of people with mental illness being dangerous, schizo, out of control, one step away from being a killer. More importantly, we know what advocates say in terms of how to fix it. We need to stop it. And what our research has really been interested in is exactly what are good ways to stop it and what are not. So what I want to do with you in the next 45 minutes is briefly, very briefly, talk about what is stigma. And then more importantly, how might it be diminished? Actually, one of the things I want to think with you out loud is some ways that seem to work well for changing stigma actually lead to unintended consequences and make it worse. Let me give you the take-home message in case you want to quit now. The take-home message is that education about mental illness does not change stigma. What changes stigma is the degree to which people interact with those with lived experience, and they can learn from themselves the quality of the lives of people with lived experience. Therefore, it leads to the idea that what I think the real power in changing stigma, and what I hope I convince you on, is the power of people with lived experience disclosing that experience. And that ended with a program we developed called Honest, Open, Proud that I've been working with Andrew on, and whether or not it might work with DBSA. So let's put this in perspective. Unlike mood disorders, which are psychiatric disorders and issues of medicine, stigma is fundamentally an issue of social justice, not an issue of medical science. America has some great examples of ability we've had to overcome social injustice. This is Dr. King coming across the Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. What we've done over the last 30 to 40 years made big movement in terms of the LGBTQ area. And you know, interestingly, disability has its own list of advocates. This is obviously in the physical disability world. I don't know if you know Justin Dart. Justin Dart is the gentleman in the cowboy hat in the lower right side in a wheelchair. He's frequently considered to be the Martin Luther King Jr. of the physical disability world. Actually, he had a big impact on George Herbert Walker Bush signing the American with Disabilities Act many years back. The problem with looking at it as a social justice issue is that we all tend to get motivated to stomp out social injustice, which rightfully we should. But in the process, we tend to run in and make mistakes. And so what I want to do today is talk a little bit about what are the mistakes, in my opinion, about changing stigma, and then what are more effective ways to make a meaningful, lasting change. Examples in history of making mistakes, as many of you may know, when Bill Clinton was our president, the military actually had an active agenda of identifying LGBT military members and pushing them out. And so as an attempt to fix this, they came up with don't ask, don't tell. If you don't tell me you're gay, I won't ask, and you can stay in the military. Perhaps at the time it seemed to be a good idea, but in retrospect, we clearly know this pushes the idea of closetedness that you still should be ashamed of yourself, keep it a secret, don't tell anybody. And unfortunately, it was an active element of the US military until Barack Obama came along some years later. Or another example, again, unintended consequences. Good idea. Good ideas. You know, Jerry Lewis did his Labor Day telethon for years and years and years. Every so often, he would go into the area of resting high on pity. So this young man had the whole thing of, if I grow up, I want to be a fireman. Actually, some years later, they interviewed him, and he said, what was wrong with that message of me wanting to be a fireman? It could be an unintentional message, but even more, you know, Jerry Lewis in the old days used to do this for 24 hours to get exhausted. In the end of one session, he actually called people with this problem God's goofs. The issue is that he was kind of an example of a person who tried to decrease stigma by resting it on pity. And pity is not the message we want to rest it on. We want to instead push for parity, that people with mental health challenges, people with mood disorders deserve the same opportunities as everyone else. I think I want to put this in perspective of who I am. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I've been so for about 30 years. My area of work is psychiatric rehabilitation. So it's working with people with mood disorders, with quite serious mood disorders, such that they can't work or get through school or live on their own. I wrote the textbook on psych rehab. I was editor of the American Journal of Psychiatric Rehabilitation for many years. Actually, last year, I wrote the book called The Stigma Effect, which focused on the unintended consequences of mental health campaigns. The holidays are coming up. If you're looking for a good investment, this makes a great stocking stuffer. But of all my different backgrounds, being a practitioner and scientist, what I mostly am is a person with lived experience. I've been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, major anxiety, major depression, generalized anxiety. I've been hospitalized. I took my meds this morning. I know the shame of calling my wife on that one phone on the inpatient unit and telling her to tell my daughter I wasn't going to make it to school that night. So stigma is not just a research abstraction for me. It's something quite personal and something I really hope we can try to fix. So where do we begin? I think we begin by getting a sense of what exactly is stigma. Sam Keene's a sociologist who wrote a book called Faces of the Enemy. And in this book, he looked at how people in control and power, all too often white men, kept other groups down using disrespectful images. And so to put the perspective of where stigma mental illness comes from, we need to start with racism. Scientists say Negro is still an ape stage. I choose to put this provocative slide up here to remind us that the stigma of mental illness is in the same category as racism or sexism or ageism. And also to put in perspective that this came from an 1890s medical textbook. And so science can really exacerbate the stigma even more. Or what Nazi Germany, this is from Nazi occupied Denmark, disrespecting a group by showing them as animals. This is representing Jews as rats. Or what one half of the population is done to the other half, so the harder a wife works, the cuter she looks. If there's any good news about these racist, sexist things, and don't get me wrong, there's no way of justifying it, but I would have seen some of this stuff in my lifetime. I would have definitely seen this advertisement in my lifetime. You don't quite see that as much. I mean, sexism, racism is still a big problem, but it tends to be more undercover. Not so with mental illness. I mean, if you want to see the stigma of mental illness, all you have to do is listen to talk radio on the way home when they're talking about wackos and psychos and nuts. It's still quite well. So stigma of mental illness can be broken into different categories. One is that people with mental illnesses are all homicidal maniacs. You see that in movies. The most popular cinematic maniacs is Darth Vader. This is Freddy Krueger or Jason from Friday the 13th, Part 3. You see it in newspapers. Now, the problem with newspapers is they're supposed to be the font of knowledge from which society can work from. This is from the New York Post, Freed mental patient kills mom, or from the Daily News, get the violent crazies off of our streets. Now, let's be honest, these are tabloids, and this is what tabloids do. But there's still examples of good intentions that go way astray. I'm sure all the participants today who know Chicago would recognize the Reader. The Reader is a very well done weekly. And in this story, the gentleman on the left, who was a physician, killed his wife in a drug-induced psychosis. So he ended up spending about 15 years in Elgin State Hospital, which is the forensic unit outside of Chicago, was ready to be released. Everybody thought it was time, it was a good thing. Ted Klein, the reporter, wrote a really balanced article, but the editor threw this title on it. And as a result, he ended up spending many, many more months at Elgin. You see it in advertising. This offer could get you committed. Crazy Eddie's Record Asylum. To offer these deals, we have to be committed. Maniac out of control. Or this, lobster lunacy. This was actually from a billboard I saw outside Washington, D.C. Sometimes people say, shouldn't you just lighten up? I mean, isn't this just political correctness? Couldn't we laugh this off? Of course, this is what you might have said in the past about this. The chef does everything but cook. That's what wives are for. Hopefully, just as most of us are appalled at that, so similarly an ad like this should be equally of concern. This won the Clio Award, which is the Academy Award of Advertising. And in case you can't make that out, that's a straitjacket filled with nuts. So you see it in comics. I love Gary Larson, but there's two things wrong with this. One, it's just a blatantly disrespectful statement on the pad of paper. And two, is this is a psychiatrist doing it. If he's laughing at the patient, it must be okay for everybody to laugh at the patient. Sir, these gentlemen from the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission are here to explain new rules of mental illness in the workplace. So again, I talked about the ADA, which was passed in 1990. It was in place 5 years before anybody ever thought about applying it to psychiatric disability. At the time, the EEOC put out an administrative order says, in fact, it does apply. And you got reactions like this: careful, at work's going to have these naked guys or mass murderers or Napoleonic figures around. S is for Stanley. Stanley's a crazy murderer who likes to murder little boys and girls early Sunday morning. Are you afraid of Stanley? This comes from a Shel Silverstein book. I actually pulled it off my daughter's shelf when she was about 8. And for those of you who know, Shel Silverstein is frequently considered the William Shakespeare of children's literature in the United States. Now, the stigma I focused on here mostly is the idea that we're dangerous. And don't get me wrong, research pretty much suggests that's probably the most egregious, the most harmful stigma, because if you think we're dangerous, you're not going to want to hire us or let us come to school. But there are other ones. Another one is called the benevolent stigma. That's not the idea that stigmas really can be benevolent and okay. It's more the idea that people with mental illness are big, lovable buffoons, big children, and they need a benevolent figure like a doctor to tell them what to do. So you see it in the Dream Team. This is Christopher Lloyd, Peter Boyle, Michael Keaton. They're for psych patients who get away from their keeper in Manhattan, have this silly day popping around the Big Island, because that's what they do. Or this time they kind of got both of them together. You got Jim Carrey and Me, Myself, and Irene on the left. He's kind of the chucklehead police officer. On the right, he's kind of the demonic police officer, putting them both together. Or this, how to avoid hiring lemons, nuts, and flakes. And we got several different groups here, but what's most of concern here is that an HR, human resource department at a major company is the one that came up with this flyer. So is it any better? I have had the privilege of doing this presentation for a few years, so some of these are old. More recent examples, to understand this example, you're looking in the front window of a printing company in downstate Ohio. Pretend the woman's not there, she's the owner of the company, and what do you see? See a bottle of booze on its side, chair kicked over, 2 legs hanging down, and a note saying, contemplating suicide? Get your suicide notes printed here. If that's not a big enough concern, she's the owner, and when they try to explain it to her, she didn't see what the big deal was. Or this, many of you probably saw A Beautiful Mind. This is where, I'm blocking on his name, John Nash would go when he would relapse. This is a state hospital in downstate New York. They had a fire, no real damage to people, some property damage, but the next day the headline said roasted nuts. Clearly, the stigma of mental illness is blatant and obvious. What does research show about it? A friend of mine named Joe Phelan and Bruce Link did a study looking at the degree to which the population, the average person on the street, thought people with mental illness were dangerous. And again, we can talk about it if you like, about whether they're dangerous or not more than other people. But generally, the research suggests that that's way overestimated. And so what you might think is perhaps in 1956, about 40% of the population thought people were dangerous. And in 1996, it got cut in half. And that would show because we're much more educated about mental illness and the stigma would go down. Actually, it went in the opposite direction. During that time, the belief in America that people with mental illness were dangerous doubled. And they repeated it again in 2006 in equally of problems. Now, people like to post hoc the data. One way people sort of try to figure out why this is the degree to which mental illness is tied with these god-awful shootings we have in the United States. I'm of the ilk that believes we shouldn't name the shooters in any way trying to glorify it, but these are people from Colorado and Arizona and Connecticut who all did god-awful shootings. And so it sort of makes unreasonable sense that the average person would think people with mental illness are dangerous. In fact, I had a colleague in Australia who did a study, Anthony Jorn, who did a study after the Sandy Hook shooting, the one where all those children were killed. The stigma of mental illness in Australia got worse. Now we might think, well, these are just data, what does it really matter? Until you put it in perspective, the bigots take this kind of stuff and run with it. And perhaps one best example of a bigot is after the Parkland school shooting, he said, part of the problem is we used to have mental institutions. We take a sicko guy like this. We're going to be talking seriously about opening mental health institutions again so we can lock them up. I'm sure everybody agrees with me. Hospitals, mental health institutions are the least effective, least way of investing in promoting people's health. So how do I understand exactly what the stigma of mental illness is? As Andrew said, I am a professor, and like any professor, I can reduce everything down to one box. And so this is my comprehensive model of how you understand the stigma of mental illness. It's by structure, stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. And so some way the stigma of mental illness is in the same category as other groups. So let me tell you a group I know a lot about. What are the stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination about Irish Americans? The stereotypes that we're all drunks and we neglect our families. Here's the issue about stereotypes. You cannot, they permeate our society. I mean, the reality is I bet most people here who are on the call who were born in America have heard that we're all drunks and we neglect our families. We've all heard stereotypes about Black people and Latinx and women. Prejudice is agreeing with it. Yep, that's right. They're all drunks and having an emotional reaction to discrimination as a behavior. We're obviously much more interested in what is the stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination about people with mental illness. The single stereotype is that we're dangerous. Whether or not you have schizophrenia or even a more benign sort of issue like an anxiety disorder, the public tends to lump everybody together and think we're dangerous. On top of that, there are beliefs that we're weak, that we're incompetent, that we chose to be this way. I love the one about being chose to be this way, because when I was in the hospital, it was the first thing in my mind is I chose to be crazy to end up in the hospital. Prejudice is agreeing with it and then having a view of them being bad. They're either scary because they're dangerous, or they should be ashamed of themselves because they don't pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And then we're going to drill down more into what we mean by discrimination. But you understand stereotype, prejudice, and discrimination in terms of three different types. There's public stigma, what the public do to people with mental illness when they agree with it. Self-stigma, which is what we do to ourselves when we internalize it. And label avoidance, which I'll talk about more in a minute. Public stigma is there's clear evidence that if an employer knows you have a mental health diagnosis, they may be less likely to hire you, or even more concerned, don't know how to provide reasonable accommodation. Housing is worse, educational opportunities are limited. The legislature doesn't support the kind of programs we work. There's a sad irony of faith-based communities where people might look for a little support and integrity, and instead faith-based communities are overwhelmed, and this inappropriate call for coercive treatment, for example, forcing people to take meds. One piece of data, I'm really trying to eschew data today because it's 3:30 and you guys have been doing this for 2 days, so I'm not going to hit a lot of data, but one piece of data that's really quite sobering, as this is a finding from a friend of mine, Ben Druss, where he looked at about 20,000 cases of veterans presenting to their primary care doctor with shortness of breath, rapid heartbeat, flushing, and the like, such that they needed to be referred for PTCA. I had to look up what PTCA is. I don't know, but PTCA is, you mean the primary care doc should have sent you to a cardiologist. In 100% of the time, if you presented to that and the doc thought you had no mental illness or substance abuse, you got referred. In 80% of the time, if the doc thought he had substance abuse, you got referred. 20% did not. Less than half of veterans who presented such that the doctor thought they had a mental illness got referred. This is not just an attitude anymore. This is an issue of life and death. And this is physicians doing this. This is not quote unquote uneducated people. Stigma has huge risks in terms of when the public buys into it. Self-stigma is what happens when you internalize stigma. You internalize stigma, it decreases one's sense of self-esteem. I feel like I'm not a worthy person, or decrease a sense of self-efficacy, I'm not able, which I always thought was a double whammy of being depressed. I mean, it's hard enough being depressed and questioning your worth and feeling ashamed of yourself. And on top of that, you got to think you're a loser because you have a mental illness. It also leads to the why try effect. Why should I try to get a job? I'm not worthy of it. Why should I try to live alone? I'm not able. And so if our number one goals of programs to help people promote recovery is to help them get a job if they want, or help them live alone if they want, then self-stigma undermines that. Finally, there's this issue called label avoidance. Let me try to put that in perspective. The original Eugene Goffman is the original sociologist who started talking about stigma in the 60s. And he used the word stigma because it's actually a Greek word for a mark. And so Greeks used to brand their slaves on the cheek as a way to mark them. And so stigma was thought to be marked by obvious sort of things. And so if I'm a racist and I see somebody with different skin color, I can react to them. Or if I'm a sexist and I see somebody with female features, I can react to them. Or if I'm an ageist and I see somebody with gray hair, I can react to them. Here's the issue about the stigma of mental illness. The stigma of mental illness is fundamentally hidden. If you're in a room with a group of 100 people, you cannot tell in that group who does and who does not have a mental illness. You might think you can, but clearly evidence shows that we tend to use all sorts of cues that in fact don't represent mental illness. For example, for the longest time, we thought homeless, disheveled people were all mentally ill, and they're not necessarily that. In some ways, the stigma of mental illness is a lot like the stigma of LGBTQ. Again, let me be clear, because I've said that for a while. I am not saying LGBTQ people are mentally ill. Absolutely not. I'm saying what they both experience is having a stigmatized life experience that they can hide, that they can choose not to share with other people. And as I said, being in the closet is bad. But here's how I do know whether or not a person has a mental illness. I know that if I see them coming out of the doctor's office. I know that if I know they're coming from a psychiatrist, I might say, hey, there's Frank. He's coming out of the doctor's office. He must be crazy. And the problem with that is it will lead to label avoidance. Label is the idea Frank is crazy. He wants to avoid the label. The way he avoids the label is he won't seek out care when he needs it. Evidence shows that people with serious mental illness, people with mental illness, whether they have benign mental illness, I mean, what's a benign mental illness? Whether they have a reaction to a loss of a loved one, or they have a more serious schizophrenia, regardless of that, about 45% of people with serious mental illness will not seek out care. And so that's a recurring concern for all of us, because we clearly know there are treatments for mood disorders right now that some people won't pursue because they don't want to be looked at as crazy. You know, erasing stigma is not enough. It's not enough to get the world to stop thinking we're crazy, out of control and the like. You know who talked about this well was Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson was the person behind the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and he went to a commencement at Howard University, a historically black college. And at that black college, he was talking about the changes that came around. He said, you do not wipe away the scars of centuries by saying, now you're free to go where you want and do as you desire and choose the leaders you please. You do not get rid of racism just by passing a law that doesn't apply anymore. He really called for affirming attitudes and actions. To me, I know the stigma is going away when we replace notions that we're all dangerous with the affirming attitudes that people with mental illness recover. That's the rule, not the exception. In fact, recovery is not necessarily being symptom-free, but despite one's symptoms, they can pursue their goals, and that they therefore should determine for themselves what their goals are and what interventions they wish to use to pursue them. In addition, though, attitudes are not enough. We need to change the world. Reasonable accommodations is clearly one. It's written in the American with Disabilities Act. If a person has a mood disorder and goes and gets a job, it's incumbent upon that employer to tweak that job so they can stay on it as long as it is not, quote unquote, called undue hardship. In addition to that, we should support community supports. And you know what's one awesome community support in America is DBSA. And so society should be invested in supporting something like DBSA to keep its citizens effective pursuing their goals in their world. So they said the goal is to fix it and that there are frequently unintended consequences. So I want to start by debunking what seem to be some easy ways to change stigma that in fact don't work. And so for me, the focus here is on public stigma. For me, there's three ways to change public stigma: protest, education, and contact. Protest, don't think that way, stop it. And so one way you see protests show up a lot is this whole idea of trying to change the words around a group. So for example, leprosy is now Hansen's disease, dementia is Alzheimer's, mental retardation by act of US Congress is intellectual disability, mania is bipolar illness. The idea is changing the words should diminish the stigma. And don't get me wrong, I really invest this in two. The N word is clearly a heinous word that has no just place in a white person's language. However, the research pretty shows that different places around the world have tried changing the language. Japan went from Saishin Banetsu Biyo to Togo Shitko Sho, which translates to mind split disease, which from a Japanese perspective is really quite disrespectful, to integration disorder, which is more benign. And Korea and Hong Kong and Singapore all changed the language in which they look at a person with mental illness. And so the question is, this actually provides an opportunity for research. After Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, and Singapore changed their wording, did stigma change in those countries? Before doing that, though, one of the big issues in the United States about changing schizophrenia, I mean, schizophrenia is a problematic term. It's got schiz in it, which is sort of broken. One of the big push is calling it for Bleuler's syndrome. This will be a quick test, a multiple choice test back to your intro to psych days. Eugen Bleuler was the first Swiss psychiatrist who described the key components of schizophrenia. And so the idea is that we call it Bleuler's syndrome instead of schizophrenia, like we call Alzheimer's instead of dementia. Will it decrease stigma? There's been 47 studies on this. And in 47 studies, it has two outcomes. In terms of the general population, it makes no difference. I don't care whether you call it schizophrenia or Bleuler's syndrome or whatever, you're still nuts. It has a big impact on providers. And the one reason it has big impact on providers is when the DSM-5 came out, it changed everything. You may know when DSM-5 came out, we cured Asperger's. Because Asperger's, which is a more benign form of autism, was stripped out of the DSM-5. Providers learn the new terms really fast, because if I want a bill, I need to know the DSM terms. But does it change stigma? Probably not. The other problem Policy change. Crazy is now on the growing list of politically incorrect words. Seems it's offensive to people of a certain mental state, the sanity challenged. The other problem is it makes stigma change look easy. That all you have to do is go around and tell people to quit using those words. And the issue with that is it leads to word police. I was hired to work with a group in Denver that had been meeting for 4 months before I got there. And they were totally at odds with each other because they couldn't agree whether they were working in mental illness or mental health challenges or what. I've kind of moved to calling serious mental illness mental health challenges. I was speaking in a NAMI group in California, and afterwards somebody came up and buttonholed me and said, I don't have a mental health challenge, I have a mental illness. My point is words do matter, but we want to make sure we don't derail into this kind of argument because the average person on the street doesn't get it. And you get one shot at them, you don't want to waste it on this. A second way of looking at it is education. Let's talk about education. America has some good examples of public health attempts to try to change major health concerns. One of them is DARE. Some of us may be old enough to have children in DARE. I had children in DARE. Others might have been in DARE. DARE was typically a program done by police officers in the schools, somewhere between 6th and 8th graders. They showed paraphernalia. They talked about the risk of using drugs. At one point, it was in 75% of all US schools, 43 different countries. It's one of the rare times that the feds actually spent some significant money on research. 5 studies, 4 of them showed no effect. Kids who went to DARE versus kids who went to control group showed no difference. One of them showed significant difference. At the Indiana University, they found people who went to DARE were more likely to use drugs and alcohol at follow-up than people who did not. Or another one that's even more close to home is, there are people out there who believe vaccinations cause autism. Myself, I understand what the CDC says, and I do not hold to that, but it's obviously a major problem because if you believe your child that vaccination causes autism, you don't vaccinate your child, you put that child at risk for childhood disorders. And on top of that, you put other people at risk. And so there's been research done where they go through the CDC fact sheet about what independent thinkers think about vaccines, or they show compelling videos of what happens to a little girl when they get the illness. And the results is that showing this to a group of mothers had no effect on their attitudes. They were just as likely to continue to not want to vaccinate. And it was likely to have a worse effect on whether they would in fact take their child out and intend to vaccinate them. It's known as the don't tell me what to think effect in America. So you got to be careful with trying to educate people thinking it's going to have an easy fix. Perhaps the one people really looked at for mental illness is the idea of mental illness as a brain disorder. George Herbert Walker Bush launched the Decade of the Brain in 1990 with National Institute of Mental Health. It had many purposes, but one of them was the idea is if you went around and showed everybody what the brain looked like with mental illness, they're less likely to blame them for their mental illness. And you can see here, this is a PET scan with the occipital lobes lighting up in red, which means this person's seeing something. Lo and behold, research, including research we did, shows that the public's less likely to blame somebody with schizophrenia when they see this. But they're also less likely to believe they're going to get recovered. Because it's hardwired in. You look good now, but you can flip out in any minute. And that is the degree to which employers won't hire somebody or landlords won't rent to them or doctors provide a substandard of care. So what I do think is the way to go forward in changing stigma is contact, is facilitating interactions between people with lived experience and the rest of the population. The way we've traditionally done that is with Bob Lundeen. Bob and I worked together at the University of Chicago for about 15 years. He's a person with schizoaffective disorder. Bob and I actually think we're kind of spiritually linked because we were born and graduated from grade school and high school all within a month of each other. After college, grade school, high school, and college, all within a month of each other. After college, he started his career in schizoaffective disorder, I on my mental health challenges. And so when we do a contact condition, it usually looks like something like this. Hi, my name is Bob. I have a severe mental illness. We often, if you really want to get to the stigma right away, you use a label. And so he has schizoaffective disorder, which many of you may know. Schizoaffective disorder, schizophrenia, and a mood disorder. That in his case, childhood was not unusual, but that his mental illness was traumatic. So here's the problem when you meet Bob, or here's the problem with any of you tell your stories. They look at you and they go, "For real? Really? I mean, you look too good. You can't be somebody with schizoaffective disorder. You're not drooling." And so he has to qualify. And in his case, he's been hospitalized about 20 times. And when he's manic, he gets in trouble with the law. In fact, in the last couple of years, he went into a manic episode and stole a car. And despite that, he's achieved. He's now a full-time peer specialist for DuPage County Health. One of the things awesome about him is he writes plays about his mental health challenges. One of them was at Victory Gardens. So we did research on what happens when you see somebody like Bob tell his story, or what happens when an expert doctor like me tells you the facts. And so this is a result of a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is you take, in this case, 30 separate studies, you put them all in a statistical bag, you shake them up, and you add them up, and you see what comes out. So these are the findings in blue for what kind of effect education had, and in red for what kind of effect contact had. What kind of effect had overall on attitudes and on behavior. What you can see is that overall attitudes and behavior has an effect about 2 to 3 times better for contact than for education. A slide I don't have here is that effects from contact tend to maintain a lot better over time. That if you put somebody in an education condition, you come back a couple of weeks later and measure their attitudes, they're just as stigmatizing as ever. So what would I promote as a way to change stigma? We've come up with a targeted, local, credible, continuous contact approach. The whole thing rests on contact. The whole thing rests on lived experience stories like you and I have. It needs to be targeted. I'd like to wave my magic wand tomorrow and stop stigma, but it's not going to happen. So what's more effective is targeting groups that are in power for us, targeting employers so they make sure they hire us and provide reasonable accommodations, or teachers so they make sure they give us all the rights we have in college, or landlords so they rent to us and the like. Local, we did this program, we rolled out this model originally in a conference in Ottawa, Canada. You may know what Canadians think of American ideas. Last time I heard, they're building a wall trying to keep us out. Even more so, what makes this more difficult in the United States is we are really a diverse place. I mean, as you know, for those of us on the call from Chicago, we're right in the middle. We're the heartland. We are the true Americans. Everybody on the East Coast is pumped up on caffeine, and everybody on the West Coast is zoned out in marijuana. And so if you're going to develop a program for Illinoisans, it needs to be focused in Illinois, but even that's not enough, because you know Illinois is really quite a diverse place itself. And so there's an expression, doesn't play in Peoria. If you're going to develop it in Peoria, it needs to have Peorians doing the development. The other two issues is that stigma change needs to be credible and continuous. I have not had the honor of serving in the US military. I have worked a lot with both the Department of Defense and the VA on anti-stigma approaches. And we clearly know that if you're trying to talk to the military about stigma change, the military needs to talk to the military. Marines talk to Marines, sailors talk to sailors, Army talks to Army. Generally, research shows enlisted personnel have credibility for other enlisted personnel, but not for officers. And finally, continuous. Meeting Bob once is good, but it's not enough. And carbon copies don't do it. And so what is my grand plan for changing the stigma of mental illness? In the LGBTQ world, again, I'm old enough where being gay was pretty universally suppressed and pretty risky if you did come out. About 20, 30, 40 years ago, brave gay men and lesbian women came out. And the degree to which they came out everywhere is a degree to which we change the stigma of mental illness. It's not because in school we taught our kids it's genetic or it's hormonal. It's because we got to, for ourselves, meet people with lived condition. And so same thing with mental illness. Is a degree to which we come out mad and come out proud is a degree to which will have a big impact. So there's a lot of famous people who have come out. Rod Steiger won an Academy Award for In the Heat of the Night with a mood disorder, Patty Duke with bipolar disorder, Mike Wallace from 60 Minutes with major depression. I love showing this slide to my students as an example of famous people who have come out because they look at this and go, who are these people? And so more recently, they've reminded me that Demi Lovato is a person with mood disorder. Actually, in the last couple of years, she's also come out with a pretty significant substance use disorder. Jim Carrey has a bipolar disorder. Leonardo DiCaprio has an anxiety disorder. Famous people come out. But you know, there's a limit to the impact of famous people. We call it the Thurgood Marshall effect. Thurgood Marshall was the first African-American Supreme Court judge. When he was appointed, people said, wow, that'll really change white attitudes about blacks, because they'll look at him and say, wow, look how cool he is. Black people must be pretty bright. But we tend not to look at that way. We tend to compartmentalize. We tend to say he's not like most black people. That's why John Nash and the impact he had had somewhat limited effects. He's a Nobel laureate. He's not like most people with serious mental illness. And so we believe what's a much bigger, better, effective way of dealing with stigma is by, and I'm still struggling for a better word for this, is the average people coming out. The person that you sit next to at church, or the person you work with, or the person in your extended family. This is a book that we published a couple of years ago, which is 41 people from around the world telling their stories of recovery and demanding solidarity. The first chapter in the book is mine. We said demanding solidarity because I would never expect a gay person to pass as straight. I would expect that I would stand next to a gay person and provide solidarity for where they're at. And so that should be the demand for dealing with the stigma of mental illness. And so about 10 years ago, Bob and I developed a program called Honest, Open, Proud. The website you can go to. It's a program led by people with lived experience to try to decide whether or not they should disclose. Let's be clear. I am never trying to talk somebody else into disclosing, because I realize there's risks in it, and I would never be so naive to say, go ahead, don't worry about the risk. The program has 3 lessons. The first lesson is consider the pros and cons of disclosing, which, by the way, vary depending on whether you're talking about disclosing at work versus your apartment building versus your extended family. The second way is there's different ways to disclose. So Andrew seems to be a nice guy. I work along next to him. I could take him to Starbucks. I could say, did you see Silver Linings Playbook? What'd you think? And if Andrew says, I'm sick and tired of those politically correct Hollywood movies making people mentally ill and looking normal, then he's probably not a good guy to come out to. And the third is tell your story. It's your story. How do you want to voice it? Typically, the program is done by 2 trained facilitators, 2 people with lived experience, with 3 to 8 peers in multiple sessions. And there's a fidelity measure to it. Andrew and I have spent the last 6 months working and revamping Honest, Open, Proud for the voice of people with mood disorders. And so DBSA now has a version of it that we're working to train people up on. Let me go back again to the ideas. I do not naively recommend people come out. One Supreme Court judge said it's hard to stop the clanging bell. Once you're out, it's hard to go back in. It was a process for me, and it's a process that still changes. And so the purpose of Honest, Open, Proud is to provide a safe place where people can decide what the costs and benefits are of coming out, and with relatively safe people, try it. Pride is interesting. I mean, mental illness, is there anything to be proud of? Well, on one hand, I think it is an accomplishment. I mean, I've been fortunate, despite my mental health challenges, of somehow getting through school and becoming a doctor and the like. And so overcoming a disability is a major thing. And let's be clear, I, by a long shot, don't think you have to get a diploma to be considered accomplished. People make these steps in very little different ways. But another way of doing it is it's just who I am. Many of you may recognize this as the Irish flag. One of the best things my parents ever did is named me Patrick, because on March 17th, I don't have to buy a drink. I didn't do anything to earn this. It's just part of who I am. And so because it's part of who I am, if I want to share it as an authentic person, then I should be able to share it. The idea of disclosing is not going out and disclosing people to ask for help. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's important. This is disclosing to show I'm an authentic person. I'm a full person. This is part of my identity. It really meant to change the dialogue. When I was in graduate school, I learned that you don't want patients to admit they have a mental illness. You want them to run away from it, keep it in the closet. And what the younger generation has taught to me is mental illness, like lots of other things, is part of who I am. And if I want to embrace that and share it with people, I should. I may want to be strategic about it and decide who. I may not give a damn, decide with everybody, but I gain power by knowing I have that decision. We sort of believe a program like Honest, Open, Proud has a two-fer effect. It has two benefits. One is, again, our research and other people show being in a closet is horrible for your health and well-being. Keeping a secret, like if you're gay or if you have a mental illness or if you have another thing that can be hidden, is horrible for one's sense of well-being. The other thing, though, is it's the first step for changing public stigma, because as I said, the way you change public stigma is the public interacts with people with lived experience of telling their stories. That means they chose to disclose. So the more people that are out, the more people who choose to disclose, the more likely we're going to tear down stigma in a big way. We've done a lot of research on this. For any of you who are research hungry, we've done 4 randomized controlled trials. It's 4 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon and it's kind of tiring. So I'm not going to go into the data. I imagine Andrew somewhere, well, actually I have my email address at the end. I'd be glad to go through it if you like. But more importantly, we're really quite pleased on the degree to which Honest, Open, Proud over the last 10 years has been moved around the world. And originally it was an Aussie and USA sort of thing. So we obviously shared a language. It's since then been written, converted to several languages in the European Union, the Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, Italy, Czech Republic. But you also need to revamp things for culture. I mean, the Scots really tore it up because the Scots didn't like some of the ways we talk about things. I mean, Americans talk differently. Even within America, I think it can be a bit hard to see if we can come up with a consensus if Black Americans and Asian Americans and white Americans can all approach this the same way. What we're really excited about, we spent the last year working in China and Hong Kong and Chengdu, and they just finished a study on its effect, which seems to be working out pretty well. So let me end by putting this in perspective. I do a lot of talking to clinicians about what's good ways to deal with serious mental illness and mood disorders. But I don't come here today speaking to you as clinicians. I come to here today speaking to you as advocates. And so again, the United States has had some proud examples of advocates who've made a big difference, obviously Dr. King being one. But we have the same thing in the mental health side. This is Clifford Beers. Clifford Beers was hospitalized in a state hospital in Connecticut at the first decade of the 1900s, roughly 1902 to 1904. He came out and said, I must fight in the open. Think of this. He did this in 1909 when he came out, and he started what was called the mental hygiene movement, which since has moved into Mental Health America. So we do have proud examples in our history of people who've come out trying to change the dialogue, and it's made good steps. Similarly, I like to end with a prayer of a very famous example of a civil rights person. Mahatma Gandhi said, let our first act every morning be to make the following resolve for the day. I shall fear no one on earth. I shall fear only God. I shall not bear ill will towards anyone. I shall not submit to injustice from anyone. I shall conquer untruth by truth, and in resisting untruth, I shall put up with suffering. Obviously, Mr. Gandhi knew what he was talking about. He's a great model for us. Thank you for listening. This is my email address, also the website for Honest, Open, Proud. I am an advocate as an avocation. If you email me with a question and I don't get back to you within 24 hours, I'm either on a plane overseas or I'm dead. Okay, back to you, Eric. Any questions or comments?
Thank you,
Yes,
Pat.
we had one question so far. Let me see. It was from Paul. He said, recently the California legislature passed a bill to remove stigmatic language in the statute and code related to mental illness. Do you know if any other states have taken this step? While legislative language isn't read by most consumers, this is a good awareness piece for policymakers. I am aware of some federal legislation floating around that, but I don't know about state legislation.
So you know, California has really been a hotbed of stigma work. They passed Prop 63 about 10 years ago, thinking of all Illinoisans who were going to vote on this amendment to our the Illinois Constitution about graduated income tax. They passed a proposition about 10 years ago that said anybody who made more than $1 million a year had to pay 1% of their income into a new fund for mental health, which generated billions of dollars. And so they've always been a leader on this sort of thing. I'm okay with them changing language. Again, I just really encourage you to be careful about word police. A personal example I had is the National Academy of Science, which works at the pleasure of Congress, convened a group of scientists to deal with stigma. And the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration came in and said they banned the word stigma. I said, that's just stupid. I'm sorry, it's just stupid. You're not talking to us, you're talking to my Aunt Lillian. My Aunt Lillian worked at a Walmart all her life. She doesn't understand all this thing. We don't want to waste her time with her by getting off on language, by tisking her. We're trying to engage her in a discussion of us being whole human beings. Honest, Open, Proud actually has a section to it where we ask people in the group, how do they want to be called regarding their mental illness? I come from a very blue collar background. And so I say I'm nuts. That's what my family talks about. That's the way we do it. I know in some circles that wouldn't pass, but it's my life and that's how I choose to talk about it.
Two more quick questions here. One person asked about, they didn't quite get the concept of proud. It's not that I endorse shame, but you know, if you have a lupus or something like that, would you be proud? There was a little bit of dialogue about that, but do you want to just expound a bit more on the concept of proud?
Well, again, I start with the idea of what's there to be proud of. I mean, I've always thought the fundamental problem with mental illness is it's a group that's purely defined by trying to get out of it. And it's not so. It's part of the human condition. It's part of who we are. And part of it plays out, again, in terms of our ability to manage our life despite the disabilities. And part of it plays out because I want to say this is who I am and I don't want to have to hide it. And so that's why we think proud has some credence.
Okay. And how do you feel about the stigma-free movement and the mental health first aid projects as education?
I'm not sure if I know the stigma-free movement. So I need to be careful about mental health first aid because I have concerns about mental health first aid. I think one of the ways I would frame mental health first aid is, like many of you, I got trained in cardiopulmonary resuscitation. And that was a day-long training. When I got it, nowhere in there did they explain the anatomy and physiology of the heart. They just tried to reduce it to a simple behavior people could do to try to help somebody in a crisis. Mental health first aid, I have done the training. Mental health first aid, it keeps changing, whether it's 8 hours or 2 days or whatever. About half of it's on the DSM. And I think a DSM potentially is extremely stigmatizing phenomenon. I mean, just anecdotally, when I was a graduate student of psychopathology and I learned about schizophrenia, I was dying to go out and find a schizo. You know, I really want to go see those guys. It reduces a complex experience to this kind of simplistic language. So I'm a bit concerned about whether DBSA can make stigma worse. No freedom. Bring Change to Mind. Bring Change to Mind is Glenn Close's program. Jesse Close is Glenn Close's sister, she has bipolar disorder. I think anybody who wants to join the fray, good. I think everybody can go at different directions. I'm not necessarily going to say my direction's any better than yours. Sometimes, like anything else, I might disagree.
Okay, well, we don't have any other questions right at the moment. I'll give people a quick moment if they want to type something quickly here or raise their hand. If you want to wave your hand, I'll hopefully see you. Otherwise, I think, Andrew, we're ready to move to our small groups.
Okay.
It's a great presentation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Pat, for your presentation. Very informative and very helpful. And so as a matter of housekeeping, now that we've had our Q&A with Pat, we're gonna go back into discussion groups like we did in the last group. I'm looking at the time right now, and I'm not sure whether we will have enough time to come back and report out on what our groups discussed. And so we're still going to designate in each group a note taker to report back. If we don't have the time to come back and do that orally here, then we're going to just ask that you submit your notes to me, and I'll put my email address in the chat. We want to capture what the groups have said. But the reason why we may not end up having time to come back and report out is from there, we're going to come back here and have a presentation about the I'm Here, which is DBSA's campaign to change the conversation around public health in order to combat that stigma. And so, Eric,
yeah, I do want to note that we just got a question that says, how do we address self-stigma? Perhaps that's something we might take up though in the small groups, or do you want to just quickly say something about that, Patrick?
How do you address self-stigma? So self-stigma is, again, fundamentally shame, which is the two-edged sword of having a mood disorder. It's hard enough being depressed, but you should be ashamed of yourself. We think HOP is one way to do it. Again, the goal, and we've done 4 studies on this, the goal of HOP is not to get people to disclose. We actually find a lot of people go through HOP and don't disclose. They still find themselves less internalizing stigma because they said, wow, I didn't know I ever had that option before. I didn't know talking to all these peers that going around saying I'm bad because I have a mood disorder is wrong. And so I think that can make a real difference for people. I also think peers, I think peer support is the aspirin of mental health care right now. Don't get me wrong. I worked in the psychiatry department for 15 years. I think medications and providers definitely have their places. But peer support does a broad range of things. And one of the things it does is it tears down stigma because you're with peers who say, amen, sister. You know, me too. I'm sort of the same position you are. I agree.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm assuming by aspirin you mean it has many effects.
It's broad, and it's the intervention of choice.
Yes.
Yeah, I hopefully use that in a good way. Right.
I'm tracking with you now.
Okay, so we're
Actually,
ready.
Kimberly go, now I see. So.
No, I was thinking of it actually like baby aspirin so that I don't have a heart attack. You know, docs will give you chewable baby aspirin. It's palatable, it tastes good, it's easy to do, and it prevents a heart attack. So that's how I heard that statement. Also, that it would be accessible to larger numbers of persons, fairly easily accessible. So that's how I heard that also. I kind of liked it.
Great.
Okay.
Ready to go for small groups now, or?
I believe so.
rolled us over.
Well, I see 18 boxes on my screen, so it looks like everyone's back here in the main room. And so I will be giving our final presentation of the day. Thank you everyone for the group discussion. And like I said, please send me your notes from your discussion. We do want to capture what we've learned today. And I believe, Eric, we have the mute feature on again. I'm gonna share my screen and present an anti-stigma campaign, signature anti-stigma campaign that DBSA has. And I should say, I alluded to this earlier in the last session, and Pat talked about this as well. He talked about how people feel about the actual word stigma. And we don't want to be the word police. We don't want to tell people how to talk or what to think. But I do want to reaffirm what I said before we ended the last session, which is we are fighting stigma, but we talk about it in terms of changing the conversation about mental health. That's framing it in a positive light, that we're doing the same thing, but it's just talking about it from the other side. And so with that, I want to present the I'm Here program, a signature DBSA program that we have, that we're making available to all of our advocates, all of our chapters and their support groups, that helps to change that conversation. And so what I'm going to present today is going to be a hybrid of what you would present if you chose to pick up this mantle, as well as a little bit of additional information about how to do this presentation. So thank you all again for being here and participating. And I want to start out with a video. So hopefully you can all hear.
They just diagnosed me with bipolar disorder.
I met Sean in college. We suffered through a biology class together.
For years, I've gone through extreme highs and lows.
He was a smart one.
I stay up for days at a time,
Totally got me through the class.
then crash for a while.
Anyway, we've been best friends ever since.
Nobody knew what was going on.
I know him like the back of my hand.
I called Kay from the hospital.
Imagine my surprise when I found out he was in the hospital.
She was shocked.
He asked me to come visit.
You're here.
I'm here.
I cried so hard one day that I couldn't cry anymore.
Ted and I used to work together not that long ago, but my department moved offices.
After work, I'd go straight home and numb out in front of the TV until I fell asleep.
Hands down, one of the funniest guys I knew. Hilarious, seriously.
I felt stuck.
We had a meeting a few weeks ago and I ran into Ted.
I was lost.
There was an emptiness in his
I
eyes.
felt like I couldn't breathe.
I tried to make a joke.
I couldn't even fake a laugh.
I realized something was wrong.
Something wasn't right.
Day after day, she laid on the couch
I was so tired.
and crying. She couldn't stop crying.
I can't explain what was going on. I was confused and exhausted from my mind racing.
I felt so helpless just watching her, but I didn't know what to say.
I felt like my world was crashing.
One day I came home and she wasn't on the couch.
I couldn't take it anymore.
I heard her in the bathroom vomiting.
I didn't really want to die.
She needed help.
I needed help.
I called 911.
She called the hospital.
I'm here.
I'm here.
So the I'm Here presentation is a branded DBSA program to give peers and their loved ones or other people in their sphere of influence a tool to begin a conversation about mental health. It's an opportunity to ask for support. It's also an opportunity to offer support. It begins with this presentation. So you would take this presentation, starting with that video, then this slide talking about what the I'm Here program is. And you would take that to your chapter or whatever community organization you would like to bring it to. And we provide a couple of educational slides, and then we actually get into what the I'm Here campaign itself is. Sorry, I have my script on another screen. So our goal is to raise awareness about mental health. Overall, we've already talked with Pat about the lack of awareness in our society and how that contributes to stigma. But then individually, people don't necessarily have a lot of awareness about what resources are out there. But what the I'm Here campaign is primarily addressing is interpersonally. People don't know how to offer that support, how to ask for support if they're needing it. And that's what our campaign is all about. It gives an opportunity to open a line of communication with someone in your circle. And we believe that this campaign can shift that conversation, that public conversation about mental health, by shifting individual conversations that people are having with their people in their direct sphere of influence. And so in the I'm Here program, we have this slide where you would give some facts about why we're here and why we're doing this. People living with mental health conditions come from all walks of life. 1 in 5 adults in the US experience a mental health condition each year. And we've already talked about what can happen when people don't have access to treatment. Major depressive disorder is the leading cause of disability in the US. And the loss of productivity from experiences of depression is due to missed work or underproductivity at work is estimated at around $63 billion across the entire country. But what's really much more tragic than that is talking about the cost of human life. The fact that 25 to 50% of people living with bipolar will attempt suicide at least once in their life. There is hope. And DBSA believes in hope. That's what we were founded on as an organization. And that includes peer support, looking at the treatment success rate for bipolar disorder. That's around 80%. That's definitely a high number. We've already talked about whether people believe in treatment, which type of treatment they believe in, whether that's talk therapy or needing access to medical products. We've talked about peer support and how DBSA was founded on peer support, and the fact that we're still fighting to push for the promotion of peer support. And so whether you are a person with lived experience asking for support, or you're a friend, a colleague, a loved one, and you're seeking to offer that support, that's what the I'm Here campaign is designed to do. It is a safety pin. I'm wearing mine, but it's somehow conveniently off of my Zoom screen. with green beads on it. And I'm going to take mine off now to show it to you. But it comes in a little packet with a business card in it that talks about the I'm Here program and what it is. And the little plastic packet is big enough for a business card, and it holds 2 safety pins in it and enough green beads for the 2 pins. We actually have specialty safety pins that don't have the little loop at the end so that you can get the beads all the way around to the other side. The safety pin represents creating safety in numbers. The green beads, green is the color of mental health awareness. Now, similar to ribbons and bracelets that other organizations have that are also green and also about raising mental health awareness, you can wear the I'm Here pin around on your lapel or on your clothing, and people will see it and ask, hey, what's that bead, or what's that pin all about? And it gives you an opportunity to start that conversation. One major difference between this program and other wearables is this slideshow presentation that you can bring to community organizations and have an opportunity to sit down with people and tell them about the program, educate them so that they can then ask for more green beads and continue that domino effect. But the other is what the I'm Here is all about and entails is creating the pin together, that having a conversation with somebody else while you put the beads onto the pin. And that's why every packet comes with 2 pins, is so that you can talk to someone in your sphere of influence and say, hey, I'd like to have a conversation with you. That activity of putting the beads on the pin serves as a focal activity so that you're not looking each other directly in the eye, so that you're looking at your hands, and so that you have something that you're doing that makes it a little less uncomfortable, a little less awkward or unbearable to tell somebody something that would be difficult to say, whether you're the one asking for the support or whether you're the one saying, hey, I've noticed something. I don't know how to say this to you. This gives that avenue and that opportunity. And then, of course, I mentioned wearing the pins out in public, and then again, having that opportunity for that conversation starter with other people who ask about the pin. And so some of the key benefits of the I'm Here program is we've already talked about amplifying the peer voice and empowering people through advocacy. It promotes mental wellness. We talked in my discussion group about the word recovery and the idea of wellness, the idea of, and I talked in the panel this morning about the spectrum of mental health that I believe in, that we're all on a spectrum and we're all moving towards maintaining our own wellness. It also reduces isolation and gives people that avenue of connection, that opportunity to have that conversation. And then to Pat's point about discrimination, that the more we promote positive conversations around mental health, the more we promote mental wellness and normalize mental health and mental wellness, the more we fight discrimination and stop stigma. And so at this point in your I'm Here presentation, if you choose to take that to a community organization, we provide the packets, and all we ask is that you tell us the organization that you're taking it to and how many packets you need. We'll provide training on how to give this very presentation. And then after you give the presentation, those slides about the background on mental health and why we've created this campaign, which, as you can see, took me about 10 to 15 minutes to get through. Then we have everybody break off into pairs and practice having a conversation with their with somebody else that's in the room with them while they're putting the beads onto the pins. At the end of the presentation, everyone gets their pin that they made with their buddy, but then they also get a fresh packet with the makings of 2 pins in it that they can take home and have that conversation with somebody else, and start that conversation. Before they break into their pairs with their buddy and practice having that conversation, we show this video that I'm about to show, and we have 2 others. This one shows an example of a family member approaching their loved one and telling them they want to have a conversation about that loved one's experience of a mental health condition.
Maria, I have to tell you, I'm a little worried about you.
Why?
I don't know. You know, we talk a lot usually, and you know, you usually seem to be having a good life, which is what I wish for you. But sometimes, lately, you just really seem like things aren't going well. Not from what you say, but just seem a little down to me.
Oh, don't you think you're just being a mom? I just have a lot going on. It's fine.
Well, and I know I'm glad you have a lot going on, but I just want you to know that I'm here for you. You know, if you ever need to talk about anything, you know, I've heard a lot, and if there's any way I can be supportive of you, I hope you know that you can reach out to me. Okay. So I don't know if you noticed this pin I'm wearing.
I did.
This is something that a friend asked me to do with her. She wanted to know that there was somebody who was there for her. And so she asked me to wear a pin, and we made these pins, and she wears one and I wear one. And it's a way for us to remember that we're there to give support to each other. So I'm wondering, would you be willing to make a pin with me and wear this? Sure, thanks, I appreciate it. So it's a couple of safety pins, pretty easy to do, and it has some green beads. And I've learned that the green stands for mental health, as the color represents good mental health, which is something I wish for you and for myself. There's some beads for you. Let's see how we can get started, and I'll have 2 then.
These are like the little friendship beads I used to make with my friends.
Well, yeah, it's something. Sometimes we have things we can talk about with friends, sometimes with family, and it's all good.
Well, I appreciate you, even though I think you're totally just being a mom. I really appreciate you.
That's quite all right. I am a mom, and I care about you. So I just want you to know I'm here.
Thank you.
So that is the I'm Here presentation. From there, you would, after watching the video, break off into pairs and practice having a conversation. And then at the end, you would wrap up, and everyone would have a fresh packet with the makings of 2 pins in it that they can bring home with them. The other thing that we do, in addition to, and this is just an adjunctive opportunity for the I'm Here program, is all of these items, the safety pin, the green beads, the little plastic bag that it came in, and the business card about the I'm Here, those all come from separate vendors. And so another opportunity for the I'm Here is to make it a volunteer opportunity for an organization. Now, when I say that, it's not just stuffing the items into the plastic bag. When we bring the I'm Here to an organization as a volunteer opportunity, they get the full I'm Here presentation. They get the 10-minute presentation about what is the I'm Here, why did DBSA develop it, why do we do it. They get the practice session with a buddy, and they get an I'm Here pin take home with them. And then that's when they can sit down as an organization and stuff the envelopes for us so that we have more I'm Here pins to send out to other I'm Here presentations. And so if this is something that you're interested in bringing to, it doesn't have to be your chapter, it could be your chapter, but it could also be any other community organization that you're a part of. I would train you on how to give the I'm Here presentation. And then we have the requirements on what your end of it would be. You would need to secure a location that you could do the I'm Here. Paul actually asked me, can we do the I'm Here over a Zoom? And the answer is yes. You could do Zoom rooms like what we did for our discussion group and put 2 people in each room, and those people could have their conversation with their partner about mental health and why they're making the pin together, and then bring everybody back into the main room. Logistically, you would have to mail the I'm Here packets to everyone who's attending. So from a logistical perspective, I'm looking at a post-pandemic I'm Here presentation, but you would need a location, you would need a projector that you could put this presentation up on a screen, and then you would need packets. So you would ask us for the packets. And again, if you're doing it just as a straight up I'm Here, you would give us the number of packets for the number of people attending. And that would be 1.5 times the number of people attending, because each person would take home 1 packet at the end, but every 2 people would split a packet during the actual presentation. And then if you're doing it as a volunteer activity, we would also send you the raw materials that you would then stuff into the little baggies at the end of your presentation. We also ask that you have people sign up for our advocacy listserv. I've dropped that in the chat several times throughout the day, dbsalliance.org/take action. But we also have a little paper pad with where people can sign up, and then if they give us their email address, then you, as the person doing the presentation, can then take their email address and enter it on their behalf into our listserv. And so we have, as part of the presentation, we just ask people, please sign up on our subscriber form. We'd love to keep you informed about DBSA advocacy. And then also just a sign-in sheet of names of people who were at your presentation so we can keep track of numbers. And that is the I'm Here program. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And we have 5 minutes, and I just want to thank everybody for for your participation and for coming out on a Saturday. I know it's a pandemic, and so you might not have had a lot of other places to go, but we really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to participate with us. Hopefully you've learned. I really appreciate the discussion groups that I've been a part of, and the larger group discussion and report out on those discussion groups. And so I believe it's 5:06 Central Time. In 4 minutes or 10 minutes now is the final closing plenary session for the summit. But I want to thank everyone for their participation, and yeah.
So very quickly, I just want to thank everyone for being here today. I think from what I've learned, I've heard some great conversations. I think there's lots of great information that, that we can take back as a national organization and learn from. Most importantly, you, the advocates, are core to systemic change in the way that we deliver mental health services, whether that's reducing stigma or through legislative advocacy to change policies in the way that healthcare is delivered. But I want to take this moment to thank all of our presenters and panelists. Thank you to our facilitators, Lisa and Douglas and Kimberly and Paul. But most importantly, I want to thank Andrew Smith. Andrew is the brains behind the whole day. He has been working tirelessly for at least 6 or 7 months. And I think let's all just give Andrew a big round of thanks and applause.
Yay.
Well, thank you. I've got my first conference under my belt now. And
Yeah.
so it's nice that it was virtual.
All right, so we'll see you all at the plenary session in a few minutes.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.